The UN Refugee Agency says war, violence, persecution, and human rights violations had caused nearly 3 million people to flee their homes last year, despite the COVID crisis that restricted movements worldwide.
The UN Refugee Agency says war, violence, persecution, and human rights violations caused nearly 3 million people to flee their homes last year, despite the COVID-19 crisis that restricted movements worldwide, as countries shut borders and ordered lockdowns. In its latest Global Trends report released on Friday, UNHCR says the cumulative total of displaced people has risen to 82 million, a figure comparable to the populations of Germany.
COVID-19 seems to have had no impact on some of the key root causes that push people to flee. War, violence, discrimination, they have continued no matter what throughout the pandemic. This is why the report, this year's report, which applies to 2020, indicates a further increase. We went from 79.5 million refugees and displaced in the previous report to 82.4 million this time round, an increase of 3 million.
It marked the 9th straight annual increase in the number of people forcibly displaced. Grandi said conflict and the impact of climate change in places like Mozambique, Ethiopia's Tigray regions, and Africa's broad Sahel region were among the leading sources of new flows of refugees and internally displaced people in 2020.
We have seen last year, and it has continued, by the way, throughout the first 6 months of 2021, we have seen some fresh displacement situations. Northern Mozambique, 700,000 internally displaced people. In the Sahel, where we estimate there's about 3 million people, refugees or displaced, of whom 750,000 under this report alone, so 2020.
UNHCR, which has its headquarters in Geneva, said that 90 countries among the more than 160 countries that closed their borders because of COVID-19 didn't make exceptions for people seeking protections as refugees or asylum seekers.
Then you have Tigray, northern Ethiopia. We estimate that up to 1 million people may have been freshly displaced by the conflict that started last October. And this is a trend that continues. So I'm worried that if the international community is not able to stop these conflicts, we will continue to see a rise in the numbers. And next year I'll be back here talking to public opinions and saying, unfortunately, the job of my organization, instead of going down, has increased again.
When he asked about U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris' recent trip to Central America, where she told would-be migrants to the United States do not come, Grandi expressed hope that the remark was not reflective of overall U.S. policy.
It's a colossal challenge. The U.S. has the largest backlog of asylum claims of any country in the world, almost 1 million people. So to manage that will require massive investments, but I am encouraged by what I heard also in Washington in my visit by the Secretary of Homeland Security and by other important political leaders. The message was probably broader, but of course that very stark sentence was reported a bit in isolation, I hope in isolation, because what I heard from the US government system in Washington was, like I said, a more complex response.